The morning sun cast long shadows across the twisted metal and scorched concrete of Pearl Harbor as Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over his desk, surrounded by towers of intercepted Japanese messages. It was late April 1942, and the cryptanalyst hadn't seen his family in weeks. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, but his mind was sharper than ever. Something big was coming. He could feel it in the patterns of enemy communications and in the increased radio traffic that flowed through Station Hypo like a river threatening to burst its banks. Outside his windowless office in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building, the Pacific Fleet was a shadow of its former self. 4 battleships lay on the harbor bottom. Hundreds of aircraft had been destroyed. More than 2,000 Americans had died on that infamous December morning. The Japanese had struck with precision and overwhelming force, leaving America's Pacific defenses in ruins. But Rochefort knew something the Japanese didn't. The Americans weren't beaten. They were learning, adapting, and preparing to strike back. "Sir, another intercept from the Japanese Fourth Fleet," said one of his cryptanalysts, placing a freshly decoded message on Rochefort's cluttered desk. The young officer's face showed the strain of endless hours spent wrestling with the enemy's naval code. "They're requesting additional supplies for something called Operation MI. Rochefort's tired eyes suddenly blazed with intensity. For weeks, his team had been tracking fragments of a massive Japanese operation. The enemy was planning something that would dwarf even Pearl Harbor. But where? When? The coded designation AF appeared repeatedly in the intercepts, taunting them with its mystery. If they could crack this puzzle, they might turn the tide of the entire war. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood at the window of his headquarters, gazing out at the salvage crews still working to raise the sunken battleships. The white-haired Texan had taken command of the Pacific Fleet at its darkest hour, inheriting a demoralized force and an enemy that seemed unstoppable.
Behind him, his intelligence officer, Commander Edwin Layton, cleared his throat. "Admiral, Rochefort's team believes they've identified a pattern in the Japanese communications," Layton reported. "Something major is being planned for early June. The scale suggests it's their largest operation since the war began." Nimitz turned from the window, his ice-blue eyes focused intently on Layton. Unlike many senior commanders who dismissed code-breaking as unreliable guesswork, Nimitz understood that information was the most powerful weapon in modern warfare. "How certain are they?" Nimitz asked. Every decision he made could mean life or death for thousands of sailors and Marines. "Rochefort stakes his career on it, sir," Layton replied, without hesitation. "He believes the target is somewhere in the Central Pacific. His team is working around the clock to pinpoint the exact location." The Admiral nodded slowly. If Rochefort was right, this could be the opportunity they desperately needed. Down in the cryptanalysis center, Rochefort's team worked with feverish intensity. The basement room was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale coffee. Banks of IBM tabulating machines clattered endlessly, sorting through thousands of code groups. Men and women in rumpled uniforms pored over worksheets, searching for patterns in the seemingly random characters. "I've got something," announced Lieutenant Commander Wesley A. Wright, one of Rochefort's top cryptanalysts. "The Japanese keep referencing water desalination equipment for AF. Why would they need special water supplies for a major target?" Rochefort felt the pieces clicking into place. A location that would need additional water supplies, somewhere strategically important enough to warrant a massive operation. His mind raced through the possibilities, and suddenly he knew. It had to be Midway, the tiny American outpost that guarded the approaches to Hawaii. One of his subordinates, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, proposed an ingenious plan. "What if we have Midway report water supply problems?
If the Japanese mention it in their coded traffic, we'll know AF is Midway. Get me a secure line to Leighton, Rochefort ordered. Tell Midway to send an emergency message in plain language saying their water distillation plant has broken down. Meanwhile, aboard the carrier USS Enterprise, Admiral William Bull Halsey lay in sickbay, his body ravaged by a severe case of dermatitis. The aggressive commander who had led early carrier raids was now too ill to stand. His task force was about to sail into the most important battle of the war, and he wouldn't be leading it. "Bill, you look like hell," said Admiral Raymond Spruance, visiting his old friend. The two men were opposites in many ways. Halsey was bold and instinctive. Spruance was calculating and methodical. But they shared a deep respect for each other and an unshakable determination to defeat Japan. "Ray, I'm giving you my command," Halsey said weakly. "Take my boys and hit those bastards hard. They trust you, and so do I." Spruance nodded solemnly. He had never led carriers in combat before, but he understood naval warfare better than almost anyone. More importantly, he knew how to listen to his subordinates and make decisions based on facts rather than emotion. On Midway itself, Marine Lieutenant Colonel Harold D. Shannon inspected his ragtag collection of aircraft. The atoll's air group was a mixed bag. Obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, already proven inferior to the Japanese Zero, alongside a handful of newer Wildcats and various bombers. His pilots were mostly green, fresh from training with little combat experience. "Colonel, are we really expected to stop the Japanese Navy with these?" asked Major Lofton Henderson, gesturing at the lined-up Buffaloes. The planes were nicknamed Flying Coffins by their pilots. "We'll stop them or die trying," Shannon replied grimly. "Every minute we delay them gives the Navy a better chance to hit their carriers. That's our job, Major. Buy time with everything we've got." Back at Pearl Harbor, confirmation came through that electrified Rochefort's team. Japanese intelligence reported in coded messages that AF was experiencing water shortages. The target was definitely Midway. Armed with this crucial intelligence, Nimitz called his senior commanders to an urgent meeting. "Gentlemen, we know where they're going and approximately when," Nimitz announced. "The Japanese are sending at least 4 carriers to attack Midway in early June. This is our chance to ambush them." Captain Miles Browning, Halsey's chief of staff, who would now serve under Spruance, studied the intelligence reports. "Sir, our pilots are reporting at least 6 Japanese carriers operational. If they bring them all—" "They won't," Nimitz interrupted with quiet confidence. "Our intelligence indicates they're splitting their forces. 2 carriers are heading for the Aleutians as a diversion. That leaves 4 for Midway, and we'll be waiting with 3. The math was still daunting. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. Their pilots were the best in the world, with years of combat experience. The American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had brave crews, but far less experience. Worse, Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea and was limping back to Pearl Harbor. "How long to repair Yorktown?" Nimitz asked. 3 months minimum, Admiral, the maintenance officer replied. "She took bomb hits that went deep into her structure, significant damage to the flight deck and fuel systems." "You have 3 days, Nimitz said flatly. "Whatever it takes, I want that ship operational and sailing with the others." As May drew to a close, Pearl Harbor became a hive of desperate activity. 1,400 workers swarmed over Yorktown, welding, hammering, and installing new equipment. Repairs that should have taken months were compressed into 72 hours. Men worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, knowing that every rivet and every plate might decide victory or defeat. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, one of the Navy's premier fighter tacticians, gathered his pilots aboard Yorktown. He had developed new tactics to counter the superior maneuverability of the Japanese Zero.
"Listen up," Thatch told his young aviators. "The Zero can outturn us, outclimb us, and it's faster, but it's lightly built. Our Wildcats can take punishment and keep flying. We're going to use a new formation I call the Thatch Weave. Work in pairs, cover each other, and never try to dogfight a Zero one-on-one." Among the pilots was Ensign George Gay, fresh from flight school with barely 300 flight hours. He tried to hide his nervousness as Thatch explained how they would attack the Japanese fleet. Everyone knew the torpedo bombers would go in low and slow, perfect targets for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. It was practically a suicide mission, but no one voiced their fears. In intelligence offices, analysts pieced together the Japanese order of battle. They knew Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was personally commanding the operation. The strike force would be led by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. The picture that emerged was of overwhelming Japanese confidence. They were coming to finish what they had started 6 months earlier. "They're bringing everything," one planning officer reported. "Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports with invasion troops. They intend to take Midway and use it as a base for further operations against Hawaii." "Let them come," Nimitz responded calmly. "The bigger the force, the more they have to lose." On May 28th, Task Force 16, centered on Enterprise and Hornet under Spruance, slipped out of Pearl Harbor. 2 days later, on May 30th, Yorktown followed, her hull still bearing fresh welds and patches. The 3 carriers would rendezvous northeast of Midway at a position designated Point Luck, perfectly placed to ambush the approaching Japanese. Aboard Enterprise, Spruance studied the latest intelligence updates with his staff. "The Japanese expect to achieve surprise," he said. "They believe our carriers are still in the South Pacific or back at Pearl Harbor. That overconfidence is our greatest advantage. We must use it wisely." Commander Wade McClusky, commanding Enterprise's air group, prepared his pilots. "When we find their carriers, we hit them with everything we've got," McClusky briefed his squadron commanders. "Dive bombers attack from high altitude. Torpedo planes go in low. Fighter cover will be limited, so speed and surprise are essential." Among McClusky's pilots was Lieutenant Commander Richard "Dick" Best, commanding Bombing Squadron 6. Best was known for exceptional accuracy in dive bombing, a skill that would soon prove crucial. "We're looking for their carriers," Best emphasized, "not battleships or cruisers. I don't care how tempting the other targets look. We sink their carriers, and we win this war." As May turned to June, both fleets moved toward their fateful encounter. The Americans had positioned themselves perfectly thanks to code breaking, but intelligence was only part of the equation. The coming battle would be decided by the skill and courage of pilots, the decisions of commanders under extreme pressure, and the thin margin between victory and disaster that defined carrier warfare. On Midway, preparations reached a fever pitch. Every available aircraft was armed and fueled. Marines dug defensive positions in coral sand. Radar operators scanned the skies continuously. The garrison knew they were vastly outnumbered, but they also knew their role: hold out long enough for the Navy to strike the enemy carriers. Commander Cyril Simmerd, Midway's senior officer, made a final inspection. Ammunition, fuel tanks, and aircraft crowded the atoll. One well-placed bomb could turn the base into an inferno. But there was no choice. Everything depended on Midway holding out. As darkness fell on June 3, 1942, American PBY Catalina patrol planes spread out from Midway in long search patterns. These slow, ungainly aircraft would be the first to spot the enemy force. Their crews knew that contact might mean death. The lumbering patrol planes were easy prey for Zero fighters, but finding the enemy was worth any sacrifice. At 9 a.m. on June 3rd, Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a PBY, spotted ships on the horizon. Sighted main body, bearing 262, distance 700 miles. The Japanese invasion force had been found, but the carriers remained hidden. That afternoon, 9 B-17s from Midway attacked the convoy, but scored no hits. 4 PBYs equipped with torpedoes attempted a night attack, claiming 1 hit. The attacks caused little damage, but they alerted the Japanese that the Americans knew they were coming. At 3 a.m. on June 4th, reveille sounded aboard the American carriers. In ready rooms, pilots received final briefings and wrote last letters home. Mechanics made final checks. Ordnance crews loaded bombs and torpedoes. 3 carriers with barely 230 aircraft were about to take on the pride of the Japanese Navy. The odds were steep, but the Americans had advantages. They knew the enemy was coming, they knew where to find them, and they had commanders willing to take calculated risks. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, in overall command aboard Yorktown, made a decision that would shape American tactics. Rather than keeping all carriers together, he would operate them in separate groups, reducing the risk of all 3 being caught at once. It was a gamble, but the entire operation was a gamble on a massive scale. As dawn approached on June 4, 1942, the stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in naval history. The Japanese came in supreme confidence, expecting to catch the Americans by surprise. Instead, they were sailing into a carefully prepared trap. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, the pre-dawn darkness over Midway was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga led 108 Japanese aircraft from the 4 carriers toward their target. The attack force included torpedo planes carrying bombs for ground attack, dive bombers, and Zero fighters for escort. As they formed up in the darkness, not one of the Japanese aviators suspected that American carriers lurked nearby, waiting. On Midway, radar operators detected the incoming strike at 5:52 a.m. Many planes bearing 320 degrees, distance 93 miles, the operator reported, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll. Marines ran to their battle stations, while pilots sprinted to their aircraft. Every flyable plane had to get airborne immediately or risk destruction on the ground. Major Lofton Henderson led Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 into the dawn sky, flying obsolete aircraft and outmatched fighters, knowing they were heading into a massacre. The Buffalo was slower, less maneuverable, and more lightly armed than the Zero, but Henderson's Marines were determined to protect their base at any cost. "Enemy fighters 12 o'clock high," the radio crackled. The Zeros pounced like hawks among pigeons. Within minutes, the sky filled with burning American planes spiraling toward the ocean. Henderson's aircraft was among those shot down. But the Marine sacrifice wasn't in vain. Their attack disrupted the Japanese formation and forced evasive action. More importantly, it bought precious time for Midway's bombers to clear the island and head for the Japanese fleet. At 6:30 a.m., Tomonaga's force reached Midway and began attack runs. Bombs rained down on the airfield, fuel tanks, and defensive positions. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black puffs of smoke. A direct hit knocked out Midway's radar. Another bomb set fuel tanks ablaze, sending thick columns of smoke into the morning sky. But as Tomonaga circled to assess damage, he realized the attack had failed in its primary objective. The runways were cratered but repairable. Defensive positions remained. Most critically, few aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. Tomonaga radioed Admiral Nagumo. There was need for a second attack wave. That message triggered a chain of decisions that would determine the battle's outcome. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a dilemma. He had held back 93 aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in case American ships appeared. Should he rearm them for a second strike on Midway, or keep them ready for naval targets? At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made a fateful decision: rearm the reserve aircraft with bombs for land attack. Crews began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and replacing them with bombs. It was dangerous work on crowded hangar decks, with armed ordnance being moved around volatile aviation fuel and ammunition. Unknown to Nagumo, American carriers to the northeast were already launching their strikes. Admiral Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, made the crucial decision to launch everything he had at maximum range. It was a calculated risk. His planes would barely have enough fuel to return, but it could catch the Japanese at their most vulnerable moment. "Pilots, man your planes," the order echoed across American flight decks. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, fully aware of the odds against the slow, vulnerable Douglas TBD Devastators. In his briefing, he had been brutally honest. "If we run out of gas, we'll ditch together. If only one of us makes it through, he'll hit a carrier. May God be with us all." Among Waldron's pilots was Ensign George Gay. By 8 a.m., the American strike was airborne, but scattered. Squadrons became separated in the clouds and proceeded independently toward the estimated Japanese position. This lack of coordination would prove both a weakness and, paradoxically, a strength. Meanwhile, Nagumo's problems multiplied. At 7:28 a.m., a scout plane from the cruiser Tone finally reported 10 enemy surface ships bearing 100 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150, speed 20 knots. The pilot hadn't identified ship types, leaving Nagumo uncertain whether he faced carriers or merely a surface force. "Suspend rearming operations," Nagumo ordered. But confusion reigned on the hangar decks. Some aircraft were fully rearmed, others half converted. Ordnance was scattered everywhere. The delay would prove fatal. At 8:20 a.m., Tone's scout sent another report that chilled Nagumo's blood. "Enemy ships are accompanied by what appears to be a carrier." The Americans had carriers at sea, and Nagumo's aircraft were caught between configurations. Worse, the first strike wave was returning from Midway, low on fuel and needing to land immediately. The first American attacks came from Midway-based aircraft, Marine dive bombers and Army bombers attacking from high altitude. They scored no hits, but each attack forced evasive maneuvers, delaying Japanese flight operations. At 9:20 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Waldron spotted the Japanese fleet through breaks in the clouds. His torpedo squadron was alone, separated from fighters and dive bombers. Waldron knew attacking without fighter cover was suicide. He also knew it might be their only chance. "Attack immediately," Waldron ordered, leading 15 Devastators down toward the carriers. The Zeros were waiting. As the torpedo bombers lumbered in at wave-top height, Japanese fighters attacked ferociously. One by one, Devastators burst into flames and crashed into the sea. George Gay watched in horror as his squadron mates died around him. Waldron's plane cartwheeled into the ocean. Others exploded in midair or broke apart under concentrated fire. Gay pressed on. His rear gunner, radioman Bob Huntington, fired desperately until he was killed by cannon fire.
Gay released his torpedo towards Soryu, then flew so low over the carrier he could see faces on the deck. Moments later, his plane was riddled with bullets and crashed into the sea. Wounded but alive, Gay inflated his life jacket and hid under a floating seat cushion, an unwilling spectator to the battle's climax. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been annihilated. All 15 devastators were shot down. Of 30 men, only George Gay survived. Their torpedoes missed or failed to explode, plagued by defects, but their sacrifice was not in vain. The attacks pulled Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, leaving high altitude undefended.
More American torpedo squadrons arrived and met similar fates. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 lost 10 of 14. Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 lost 10 of 12. The repeated attacks forced constant evasive maneuvers, preventing Nagumo from launching or recovering aircraft. By mid-morning, Japanese carriers were in chaos. Returning aircraft circled overhead, desperately low on fuel. Flight decks were jammed with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Bombs and torpedoes were scattered on hangar decks. Fire safety procedures were ignored in the rush. It was at this moment of maximum vulnerability that Commander Wade McClusky arrived overhead with 33 dive bombers from Enterprise. McClusky had led an exhausting search, flying beyond the point where fuel reserves allowed safe return. Just as he was about to turn back, he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast. Correctly guessing it was heading to rejoin the main force, McClusky followed its course. At 10:22 a.m., his perseverance was rewarded. Through breaks in the clouds, he saw the Japanese carriers spread out below, flight decks packed with aircraft. No Zeros challenged him at altitude. They were all at sea level, finishing off the last torpedo bombers. McClusky split his force and gave an order millions of Americans had been waiting for since Pearl Harbor. Attack immediately. Lieutenant Commander Dick Best led his squadron toward Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. As Best pushed over into his dive, he kept his eye on the growing shape of the carrier. At about 2,500 feet, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out sharply. Most bombs missed. Pilots were exhausted, diving through anti-aircraft fire. But Best's bomb was perfectly placed. It punched through Akagi's flight deck and exploded in the hangar deck among fueled and armed aircraft. The result was catastrophic. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as fuel and ordnance detonated in a chain reaction. Within minutes, Akagi was an inferno. Simultaneously, Kaga was hit by multiple bombs. Uncontrollable fires erupted among packed aircraft. At nearly the same time, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown scored direct hits on Soryu in a textbook attack. Within 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's premier carriers were burning wrecks. From his hiding place in the water, Ensign George Gay watched the carriers explode. Ships that had seemed invincible moments before were now funeral pyres. Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag from the burning Akagi to a cruiser, was in shock. 3/4 of his striking power had been eliminated in minutes. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were finished. Only Hiryu remained operational, racing northwest while launching a counterstrike. But the battle wasn't over. Hiryu's counterstrike found Yorktown early that afternoon. Despite determined defense, Japanese dive bombers scored hits that left the carrier burning and listing. Damage control parties fought desperately and seemed to stabilize her. Then a second strike, torpedo bombers, put torpedoes into Yorktown's hull. Admiral Fletcher transferred to a cruiser, passing tactical command to Spruance. Yorktown's crew abandoned ship, but the tough carrier refused to sink. She would remain afloat until June 7th, when the Japanese submarine I-168 found her and delivered the final torpedo hits that sent her to the bottom.
The loss of Yorktown was painful, but by then, Hiryu had joined her sisters in destruction. Late on June 4th, dive bombers from Enterprise found the last Japanese carrier and left her burning from stem to stern. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the core of the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, now lay on the bottom of the Pacific. As darkness fell on June 4th, American pilots returned with barely fumes in their tanks. Many aircraft ditched in the darkening sea. Destroyers raced to rescue survivors. The human cost had been high, but the strategic victory was complete. Spruance resisted the temptation to pursue the retreating Japanese. He knew Yamamoto's battleships were somewhere in the darkness, and his pilots were exhausted. Better to preserve victory than risk carriers in a night engagement where battleship guns could be decisive. As June 5th dawned, search planes found only burning hulks and scattered survivors. Over the next 2 days, American forces continued attacks, sinking the heavy cruiser Mikuma and damaging other vessels. The statistics were staggering.
Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and about 3,057 men, including many of their most experienced pilots. The Americans had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 147 aircraft, and about 362 men. But the numbers told only part of the story. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been permanently crippled. The initiative had passed to the Americans. In the aftermath, both sides sought to understand what had happened. For the Americans, the victory validated faith in intelligence and calculated risk-taking. Nimitz's decision to trust codebreakers, Spruance's careful tactics, and the courage of pilots combined to achieve what seemed impossible. For Japan, Midway exposed flaws, overconfidence, an overly complex plan that dispersed forces, inadequate scouting, and the fatal minutes of vulnerability during rearming. But perhaps the most important factor was the sacrifice of American torpedo bomber crews. Their attacks, seemingly futile, disrupted operations and pulled fighter cover down, creating the conditions for victory. Men like John Waldron knew they were flying into almost certain death, but they pressed home their attacks anyway. As news spread, America erupted in celebration. After 6 months of defeat and retreat, the United States had won its first major victory against Japan. The road to Tokyo would be long and bloody, but Midway proved it could be traveled. In Japan, the government hid the extent of the defeat. Returning sailors were isolated to prevent word from spreading. The public heard a story of success, but the Navy knew the truth. The offensive phase of Japan's war was over. From now on, Japan would fight on the defensive, trying to hold conquered territory against an increasingly powerful American counteroffensive. The Battle of Midway became a turning point not just in the Pacific War, but in world history. It demonstrated that intelligence, properly used, could overcome numerical disadvantage. It showed that courage and sacrifice, even in apparent failure, could create opportunities for victory. Most importantly, it proved the United States had the will and capability to defeat even the most formidable enemy. Nimitz later acknowledged the role of chance in war. If American dive bombers had arrived minutes later, after the Japanese had launched their strikes, the outcome might have been very different. Japan would never recover from Midway. The 4 carriers lost represented years of construction and decades of aircrew training that could not be replaced. New carriers could be built, but experienced aircrews could not be recreated quickly.
Midway also marked a revolution in naval warfare. For the first time, a major naval engagement had been fought entirely by aircraft, with opposing fleets never coming within sight of each other.
The age of the battleship was ending. The aircraft carrier was now the dominant weapon of naval warfare. In the broader context of World War II, Midway was the point where a seemingly unstoppable advance was not merely halted, but reversed. Combined with the grinding attrition of Guadalcanal, it marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat. America's industrial might would soon flood the Pacific with ships and planes in quantities Japan could never match. The codebreakers who made victory possible received little public recognition during the war. Their work remained classified for decades. But officers like Joseph Rochefort and his team had achieved one of the most important intelligence victories in American history. By solving the puzzle of AF and predicting Japanese movements, they gave Nimitz the information needed to position his forces perfectly. Rochefort, despite his crucial role, would be reassigned shortly after Midway due to bureaucratic conflicts. Proper recognition came much later. As years passed, Midway took on almost mythical status in American military history. Military academies worldwide studied it as a textbook example of how intelligence, courage, and tactical excellence could combine to achieve victory against superior forces. But the human dimension should never be forgotten. Behind strategy and tactics were individual acts of heroism that determined the outcome. Marine pilots flying obsolete aircraft against Zeros. Torpedo bomber crews pressing attacks without fighter cover. Dive bomber pilots searching past the point of safe return. Damage control parties saving ships that should have sunk. All contributed. Midway proved that free nations, when threatened, can summon the courage to defend themselves against any odds. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, the tide of the Pacific War had turned decisively. Japan would fight on for 3 more years, but after Midway, the outcome was no longer in doubt. At Midway, a smaller American force destroyed the heart of Japanese naval power and seized the initiative. The legacy of Midway lives on in the emphasis on intelligence, in carrier aviation, and in flexible tactics. It proved that naval warfare had entered a new age where information was as important as firepower, and victory went to those who could adapt fastest. The Battle of Midway was more than a military victory. It was a triumph of intelligence over ignorance, preparation over complacency, and courage over fear. And that lesson, written in the waters around a tiny Pacific atoll, remains relevant to this day.